Good evening, everybody. How's everyone doing out there? I have you muted, but just wave if you're doing well. Hey, excellent. My name is Kenneth Hoffman. I am the Director of Education at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. And here we are in New Orleans at a very exciting time with two storms bearing down on the city, but we don't think it's going to be too bad. So we're grateful for that. We have a great program for you tonight. We're going to learn all about taking care of our own family's stories. And we have a wonderful person to do that. A museum takes a lot of people to put together: the board, the staff, volunteers, and you're going to meet someone who is instrumental in making this museum work, our curator, Anna Tucker. But before I turn it over to her, I just want to remind you that we're recording this session, and in a couple of days, we'll have it up on our YouTube channel that you can share with people. We're also on Facebook Live, so you can revisit the program there as well. And before I turn it over to Anna, the one really important thing I want to say is that we're not open yet to the public. We'll be opening in early 2021. But we're working very hard to get open. Things are coming along wonderfully well, but we still need your support. So if you like this kind of programming and you want to see this museum open and succeed, then we ask you please to support us. You can go online, and there's all kinds of great ways to support the museum. So I encourage you all to do that. But now I'm going to turn it over to our curator, Anna Tucker, and she's going to take it from here. So here we go.
All right, good evening, everyone. If you'll just give me a moment, I'm going to set up a share screen. All right, so I like Kenneth's polling system. If you can see this, would you wave? All right, perfect. All right, so as Kenneth said, in just one moment, I seem to have an echo in here, so hold on. All right. Okay, so again, we're in a very exciting stage right now with the museum. So I'm sure as many of you know, we are covering 300 years of history across 13 different states. And an instrumental part of that is choosing which artifacts go on exhibition. And so as we're going through this process together, one of the things that I've been thinking very deeply about is the care and the protection of the artifacts while they're on view. So a little bit about my background. As Kenneth said, I'm the curator, which means I work on the care of the collection. I work on interpreting the stories that go into the museum. And I'm also helping to sort of grow the collection as well. So getting new artifacts in and working with different community members to help them build their stories as well. So my previous institution as well was a Department of Museums, Archives, and Rare Books outside of Atlanta at Kennesaw State University. So the act of collecting and preserving history is something that's very near and dear to my heart. So, and let me see if I can move this. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is how it's very important to preserve your own family history. So even if you're not working at a museum or you're not part of an archive somewhere, it's very important to think about the care, the interpretation, and the collection of your own family's histories as well. So what I would like to do during this workshop overview is to sort of provide a bird's eye view of what it looks like to take care of your family's history, to preserve your family's history. So we'll start off with some top tips of preservation. So this is something where these are the most important overview tools that you'll have, regardless of whether you're working on a photograph scrapbook or putting together a history of your family. And then we'll dive down a little bit deeper with at-home preservation techniques. So these are very basic techniques that you can use at home to be able to preserve some of your artifacts and collections. And we'll sort of go through different types of artifacts and documents that you might want to preserve. So everything from photographs to documents, even to wooden furniture as well. And then in the second half of this presentation, we'll look into what it means to preserve the future of your history. So how do you plan for the future of these items that you're collecting and preserving? And what are the things to keep in mind as you're preparing that? And then finally, we'll move on to the process of writing your family's story. And this, I think, is one of the most important aspects of collecting and preserving your family's history. It's where you have the chance to create a narrative about who you are and where you've come from. And so there are some basic organizational tips that we'll be able to share together that will help you put this in place. So this is a pretty tall order for one workshop. So what I want this to be is sort of the start of a conversation. This is a jumping off point where once we have a little bit of a groundwork, we'll be able to work together in the future to dive in deeper into each one of these areas. And just checking, can everyone hear me all right? Will you just wave if you can hear me? Okay, perfect. Okay, so the first thing that we want to go into before we jump into the how to actually do preservation is what is preservation and why is it important? So a lot of times you might hear preservation, you'll hear conservation as well. And conservation is the act of preserving or elongating an object's life through directly altering that object. Preservation also focuses on elongating that object's life. It's through altering the environment. So a good way to sort of understand this difference is with conservation, you alter the object. So you'll see on the screen, there's an image of our 1784 indenture bond that will be on view with our opening exhibitions in 2021. And we're working with the Ida Pearl and Joseph Tuba Archives for Southern Jewish History at the Freeman Museum in Atlanta for a temporary loan. And so this document is, unsurprisingly, since it's a couple of 100 years old, in need of a little bit of love and care, because when you put it on view, it goes under a little bit of stress. So a conservator, Laura Goodman, that we're working with, is here in this picture actually cleaning away dirt and debris using a little white powder that serves as an eraser. So conservators are professionals, and really they're artists in the field. And a lot of them specialize in different aspects. So there are textile conservators, there are metal conservators, paper conservators, and they're trained, highly trained, to know how far they need to go to alter an object in order to make it stable enough for the future. So it can be fairly invasive, and it's something that we as a museum choose to leave to professional conservators. On the other side, preservation, we are altering the object's environment so that it can last for a longer amount of time. So this means what sort of temperature and humidity are you storing it in? What sort of boxes are they in? Is there enough circulation of air around it? So the preservation side of things are less invasive, but there's something that can considerably extend the life of an artifact or an item. So another way to think about it is conservation is sort of the plastic surgery side of things, and then preservation more is like getting a good night's sleep, putting on some vitamin E lotion, drinking lots of water. So what we will be focusing on for this entire presentation is the preservation side of things. Okay, so first of all, jumping in with the top things to think about when you are preserving artifacts. So I'm sorry, I wanted to go back very briefly and jump into the why it's important to preserve your history or your artifacts. These artifacts provide milestones in your history and your family's history. So by preserving them, you're being able to pass on that history to the next generation. So by creating a narrative and a story, it makes it easier to share. And so I think it's something that's important, whether it's a family history, whether it's a history that's presented in a museum, or it's a history shared with friends. By preserving these documents, they have a chance of being able to be a story that's passed down through generations as well. So when we're talking about preservation, sometimes it can get, a little bit very practical, which is what it should be. But the heart of it is we're preserving stories. We're preserving your family's history when we talk about these approaches. Okay, so the top things to consider, these are sort of the four things that we always like to keep in mind when we're thinking about protecting our family's documents. So each one of them we'll talk about a little bit more in depth with specific things like photographs or film reels. But these are the four things that we like to keep in mind when we're creating a stable environment for our artifacts. So the first thing that we like to consider is temperature. So just like any other thing, we don't like things that are overly hot or overly cold. So we try to keep a fairly stable temperature for our artifacts and our items. So the Smithsonian standards usually advise around 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit for artifacts. But really the most important thing, and you'll hear me say this over and over in the upcoming presentation, is that it's best to be a stable environment. So the big swings in temperature from really cold to really hot are the things that most damage an artifact or a document. And so that's something to keep in mind, where if you're storing your items in an attic that gets really hot in the summer and then cold in the winter, you might want to start thinking about moving those items from an attic or a cellar and more into your living space or your living environment, which we'll talk a little bit about storage in a bit. But temperature is something that's a very important factor when it comes to elongating the history. The next thing to think about is light. So light damages, and what's very interesting is it's not just natural sunlight that damages artifacts, but it can also be artificial light as well. So light tends to degrade an artifact, whether it's a photograph or a document, even some physical 3D objects as well. So we try to keep things as much in the dark as possible. So that's why as a museum, every single artifact that we put on display, we actually use a mathematical formula to figure out how many hours it can be on view and then what strength of light it can be on view. But practically for you, what this means is just being aware of when photographs are in natural light or how often you take them out and put them on display. So one of the areas that I see this the most is you have an incredible portrait of, your great grandparents and it's in the entryway, but you want to be mindful that if there's natural light coming in, it's probably damaging those portraits. So some of the ways that you can get around this is you can create copies of them, so photographs or reproductions, and hang them up. Or perhaps a more feasible option is just rotate them every few months. This also gives you an opportunity to look more through the items that you have in your family collection and be able to enjoy them, switching them out from time to time. But again, light is something that whether it's a metal Havdalah set or a negative from your 1970s road trip to Yosemite, light can definitely degrade it. So we try to pay attention to that. The next thing that we look into is humidity. So anything that's too dry or too humid is also going to degrade an artifact. So I'm sure you're starting to see a trend here where the extremes are not ideal. And again, much like temperature, any huge change in humidity is something that we try to avoid. So the Smithsonian standards are 45 to 55% relative humidity. But I also understand that practically you all might not have hygrometers that you're going around measuring the humidity in your household. So a rule of thumb that I like to do with family collections is be in the room where your collection is. If you're not comfortable, your artifacts are probably not going to be comfortable either. So again, the overview of sort of the temperature, light, humidity is to start considering ways that you can move these artifacts from the attic and the basement and more into your living space as well. And then finally, probably my least favorite part of all of this, examining for pests. So I'm not going to go into all the different types of bugs and rodents that can cause damage to your artifacts and your documents. but it's something that we all have to pay attention to. So if you have a document and you notice little tiny holes in it, if you're noticing rodent pellets here and there, that's something that you'll want to address sooner rather than later. So you can just take a look around, look through all your boxes. If you see something that actually has an insect on it, you want to put it into an enclosed space until you're able to go through everything else. But again, pests and rodents, they're not the end of the world. You don't necessarily have to throw everything out. You just have to contain it and evaluate the situation. And this is also the case where not only getting your local pest control involved, but also your local historical committees, museums, archives, they can give great recommendations for the specific type of pest that you're dealing with. So one of the best ways to go about this, though, is just have regular checks because we want to be careful about the chemicals that we expose the documents to. So you don't necessarily want to go up there and spray Raid all over your documents every month. But instead, it's something where you want to pay attention to what might be there. So just doing regular checks, seeing if there are any signs of pests and trying to deal with them from there. So those are sort of the 4 big things to pay attention to, regardless of what type of artifact or document you have. And then just moving on quickly before we go into the individual types of artifacts is the handling and care. So you'll see on the right, this is actually an item from our collection. I'm using museum quality cotton handling gloves. And so this is sort of the museum professional standard. But what I want to give you are handling and care tips that you'll be able to easily, practically apply at home. So the first one is probably a suggestion that you're used to seeing at this point in the world, and that's clean hands. So I'm not necessarily recommending that you go out and purchase lab gloves or cotton gloves, though that can certainly be something that's helpful along the lines. But just washing your hands before you touch the documents, making sure that they're clear of any lotions or fragrance or oils, that will help from transferring anything to documents, especially photographs, negatives, and film, which can be very sensitive to any oils that you have on your hands. The next things with handling and care is just to be gentle. And I'm sure that seems very obvious, but it's just a reminder that when you're holding these documents, especially the ones that have had damage or they're several decades old, they can be a little bit more prone to crumbling than you might imagine. So just taking a little bit of care, when you're touching and handling artifacts, that's going to be something that goes a long way. The next thing, we're getting into a little bit of an interesting area, and that's to avoid certain plastics. Now, this is interesting because one of the things that I see with family collections is that a lot of them are stored in plastic bins. So it's 17 plastic bins in a attic or in a some other area of the house, and it seems like it protects it from moisture, and it does, but at the same time, certain types of plastics off gas, which means they release different gases that can degrade an artifact. So what we do is avoiding certain plastics like PVC and instead going for polyethylene, polypropylene. Basically, most plastics that start with poly are going to be very protective for your artifacts and your items. So I'm going to go a little bit more deeply into that later on. But that's something to be aware of, that if you have bubble wrap, if you're, securing your artifact with foam, just look at the label to see what type of plastic it is. There's also a smell test that you can do. So if you smell it and it smells very strongly of plastic, odds are it's probably off-gassing. But again, not all plastics like this will smell. So check the label and we'll be able to also help you out if you have specific questions for that. And the final thing is no chemical cleaning. And we'll talk a little bit more about the handling and care for each one of the items in just a minute. But we don't recommend anything, even water, for cleaning most of the artifacts that we handle. So usually we'll just have a very soft brush that you'll brush over, and we'll get into this when we talk about 3D objects. but resist the urge to wax or spray down wood furniture, and instead reach out to your local historical society and ask them if they have a brand that they recommend for your specific type of desk or other furniture item. And the same goes for little objects, metals as well. So we definitely recommend that you stay away from chemical cleaning and instead do mechanical cleaning, which again is just using a very soft brush from time to time. All right, so now we get to the part that's a lot of fun. So it's our at-home techniques. And one other thing that I did want to mention with avoiding plastics, you also will want to avoid tape and glue and other things to secure the artifacts, but we'll talk a little bit more about some alternatives to that. So with this at-home technique, we sort of broken it down into the most common types of documents and artifacts that you'll have at home. So these include paper documents, photographs, film, 3D objects. And as we go through this list, the most important thing to keep in mind is those 4 fundamental rules at the beginning. So looking at the temperature, the humidity, the light, and sort of the rodents and the pests as well. But each one of these has some fun tricks and rules that you'll be able to do for the specific type. So before we dive in, I'm going to be mentioning acid-free a good deal. So acid-free and lignin-free documents are something that don't have any of the chemicals or the off-gassing that are going to damage your items and your artifacts. Now, before you get nervous about, okay, I thought this was going to be an easy at-home technique, I'm not about to go out and buy all of these things. Most of these items are fairly affordable. And one of the things that I recommend is assess your collection and see if there are some old documents or some documents that are really degrading. And those are the ones that you might consider switching over to acid-free sooner rather than later. So this is not my suggestion of going out to Gaylord Archival Supplies and suddenly buying, 17 boxes to replace your 17 plastic bins. But again, this is part of an ongoing process of preservation of how you can start transitioning your items into a material that will last for generations as well. So when I refer to acid-free storage, I'm referring specifically to some of these folders, tissue papers, plastic materials, and boxes that are considered stable enough for your document. So if you'd also like a list of recommended archival suppliers, that's certainly something that we'll be able to point you in the right direction for. But as a general rule, if you look for acid-free or archival quality for any of these items, you'll be able to find some very reputable, good sources for them as well. Okay, so for the first and probably the largest subset of artifacts and documents that we have, it's paper. And so paper can be handwritten letters, they can be business documentation, they can be certificates, they can be newspapers as well. So the first thing that I would recommend for them is transferring them to an acid-free folder. So a lot of times they might be stored in plastic folders or in Ziploc bags, and this can start deteriorating some of the items fairly quickly. So the first thing that you can do is just take a quick eye check through your collection and see if any of these artifacts, especially the older ones, are starting to look a little bit rough. Those are the ones you would probably want to transfer to the acid-free folders sooner rather than later. The other thing that we encourage is to keep the documents flat. So I'm sure all of you have letters that are folded up in the envelopes. What we recommend is you take them out of the envelope, lay them flat, keep the envelope, and then put them in a folder together. The only time that we don't recommend this is when they start to crumble or fall apart when you're unfolding the letter, in which case leave it be, and there are some additional measures that you can take to preserve that. But as a general rule, letters that are left folded up, the creases can sometimes become irreparable. So try to lie the documents flat. The next thing that you try to do is keep different types of paper separate from each other. So if you have a bar mitzvah invitation and it's next to a handwritten letter from your great great grandmother, you're going to want to use some acid-free paper and just put those in between the two, because different types of ink can sometimes bleed through and impact the health or the longevity of the other artifacts as well. Sometimes, I'm sure some of you have encountered this, you'll have ancient paper clips and staples. And I get questions a lot about, should I remove them? What do I do with them? Unless they are plastic or stainless steel, we do recommend that you remove them. A lot of times, especially, they'll have rust around them. So you can just very gently lift them off. You can take a soft, clean makeup brush and sort of dust off some of the rust so it doesn't get onto any of the other artifacts. You can also put some acid-free paper next to it to again protect some of the other artifacts. But we don't recommend keeping rust there because that is something that can damage your document. So if you do like to use paper clips, you can use plastic paper clips. But otherwise, we do recommend that you remove it. Staples are also challenging. You can remove them from the back so you don't rip through the paper. But again, if it's rusting, that's something that we recommend that you start moving those out of your collection. And then finally, just before a note on newspapers, the hardest thing to say is please avoid the temptation to laminate things. And unfortunately, the combination of the heat and the type of plastic that's usually used seals it in. And in order to be able to get it out again, you have to use heat. Again, like we talked about, extremes of heat degrade an artifact. So if something is laminated in your family collection already, that's fine. That is totally fine. You know, it will maintain a certain level of longevity. So we don't recommend that you try to take it out of the laminate. But again, if you're eyeing a document and you have a lamination machine nearby, just separate the two. So acid-free folders will actually keep them in better shape for longer, even though it doesn't feel that way, it will. Okay, so I wanted to bring up newspapers because they're a special animal when it comes to paper documentation. I don't know if you've noticed in your collection, but they're the ones that always seem to crumble the fastest. They discolor a lot. And one of the reasons why is the high acidity that's within the newspaper and the print, or the ink rather. And so one of the challenging things that we have to encounter is, what do you do with all of these newspapers? So the first step that I like to go through is sort of examine whether you have just a clipping or whether you have the entire newspaper. So we recommend that you try to focus more on individual clippings rather than keeping the entire newspaper that clipping is in. One way, if that feels challenging to you, is doing a quick Google search to see which archives have these newspapers. A lot of universities will have the newspapers all the way back to the beginning of whatever journal that is. You can also contact them if you're unsure and just ask and say, I have an original of this. And they'll be able to say, you know, oh, we already have it digitized, that's fine. So when you're keeping a newspaper clipping, you don't necessarily, even if it's already in the archive, need to throw it out. You know, that's definitely something that is a part of your family collection. And I encourage you, if it's part of that story, to keep. We do suggest that you keep it away from the other paper documents. So you can separate it with an acid-free piece of paper. And then the other thing that you can do with that is photocopy it. So because newspapers degrade so quickly, even if you keep an acid-free paper, it might not make it for very long. So I'll talk a little bit about digitizing your collection in a minute, but definitely see if you can photocopy it or scan that newspaper, and you already have a digital backup copy of it as well. Okay, so moving on to photographs. So photographs are probably the second largest part of family collections that we encounter, and they're so exciting. And I think they're one of my favorite things because, you know, pictures really do tell 1,000 words, but photographs can degrade fairly rapidly. They are especially sensitive to light and to temperature. So photographs tend to like it a little bit cooler, even more so than paper documentation or other 3D artifacts. So again, if you're strapped for space and you're not able to bring everything down into your temperature or climate controlled living area, I would definitely recommend looking at the photographs first to move down. So photographs, negatives, film, just because they are just a little bit more sensitive. So one of the things that you might have noticed is sometimes photographs stick together. Again, that's because of fluctuating humidity and temperature. So what we like to recommend is putting these photographs into an archival album, or you can put them into little poly plastic sleeves that keep them separated. And something that I employ a good deal in our collections is separating them with acid-free paper as well. So especially if you have a large number of photographs, the album is probably going to be the way to go in terms of getting the most bang for your buck and for your space. But also, if you're someone who has hundreds of photographs and you're feeling overwhelmed about which ones to preserve, go through and select 3 to 5, and maybe those are the ones that you're able to put in the acid-free archival quality albums. And then you can get to the other ones eventually, but not feeling overwhelmed with the number of photographs that you have and what to do. That's sort of my encouragement to you. Go through and see if there are any, especially if they're deteriorating, if they're older, or if they have significant meaning to you and your family's story. I know that I had already mentioned sort of being gentle with photographs. If at all possible, don't use your fingerprints when you're holding a photograph. So try to hold it on the side. You can use 2 hands if needed. If you have a hard time with that, this is an instance where I'd recommend using some gloves because fingerprints can actually stay on photographs. So if at all possible, carefully hold those photographs and don't get your fingerprints on them. A lot of you have albums that are cloth or they're paper, and many times these albums are part of the historic nature of that photograph. So they have important information written next to it. The way that they're arranged in the album is very important. So unless the album is falling apart or there's mold or mildew, we encourage you to try to keep that that photo album intact because it's part of that photo's history as well. I will go into one instance that we don't recommend that, but for just one final note on albums, if you do decide to take the original photographs out of the album, we highly recommend that you keep track of where they are in chronological order, and also keep any notes that are next to the photographs with those original photographs. So that's something that photo albums are just a treasure trove of information. So trying to keep that information together as much as possible is very important. Okay, so I have one special call out when it comes to photo albums. So how many of you recognize these type of photo albums? You can just wave. Okay, I see a few people waving. So they are called self-adhesive or magnetic photo albums. They especially became popular in the 1970s and 1980s, and they sort of maintained this popularity. Unfortunately, they are not great for photographs. You might even see along the album corners that they start to yellow, they start sticking to the images. So these are one instance that we do recommend that you remove them if possible. So the way that you do that is you peel back the film, being very careful, and then using just a little piece of mylar or unwaxed dental floss actually is something that's a museum standard. You slowly work from the corner and lift off the photograph. Again, like all the other photographs, we recommend that you document and scan where they are in the folder before you start removing them. But again, this is something where we highly recommend that, especially if you're seeing discoloration, trying to remove those. Now, if you're not being able to lift it off and it starts tearing, go ahead and leave it where it is. If it's a photograph that's very significant to you, you can contact a conservator or historical society to see if they have further recommendations. Okay, so something that is closely associated with photographs. These are the even more sensitive brother of photographs. So slides, negative, film, they also like much cooler temperatures than you might imagine. So again, if you sort of have a range, or on the side of slightly cooler and dry conditions for slides, negatives, and film. So it's much like the photographs. We recommend acid-free, archival quality notebooks, albums. There are different sleeves that you can put them in. But one of my strongest recommendations is go ahead and transfer these to a different format. So have the negatives reproduced into photographs, have the slides also produced into photographs, back up the film. So if you have it on VHS or different types of millimeter film, going ahead and moving that to a different format that's more sustainable. But once you do that, go ahead and keep the originals as well. That way, if something happens in the process of the transfer, you still have that original. But again, like photographs, they do not like the sunlight. They don't like the hot temperatures or the humidity as well. All right, so moving on. Oh, and one final thing about these, they also are not great with dust as well. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're flipping through. Okay, so the last category, very broadly, are objects. So these are any 3D objects, from a wooden shoe stretcher to a metal cigarette case, to any Judaica you have in your house. It's fabrics, it's textiles. So these objects have a range of different sort of professional standards, but for the purpose practically of you preserving them in your home, much like everything else, we recommend a stable environment. So putting it into an environment that is stable in temperature and in humidity, that's not exposed to a good deal of natural light, that's the best way of preserving these artifacts. The other thing that we recommend for 3D artifacts is to keep them free of dust as much as possible. Dust actually attracts moisture. And I know it's hard when you have tons of boxes of artifacts. But one thing that we recommend is just a very soft, clean brush. Just gently go over it. So again, don't use soap and water, sort of refrain from any of those chemical or stiff brushes as well. So especially if it has like corners or there's any sort of deterioration, be very gentle with it. Some types of ceramics and glass, you can also very gently clean with a toothbrush. A toothbrush is great for some of those little nooks and crannies. And as always, if you have questions about it, you can reach out to a conservator, you can reach out to us, to a local museum, and just see if we have any specific recommendations for your artifact, because as you can imagine, they run the gamut. One thing that we also recommend is that if you have different types, keeping them sort of protected from each other. So you don't necessarily want, your kiddish cup to be right up next to that wooden shoe stretcher. So one of the ways that you can do this is wrap it in acid-free tissue paper. So it doesn't have to be, very many sort of wraps around of the tissue paper, but just enough to sort of protect it from each other. So, and one final thing for object storage, again, this is a recommendation for archival boxes. So this will you protect them. They're pretty solid. There's a range of budget from very, inexpensive to wildly expensive. For an at-home collection, you don't necessarily need to, blow the bank on it. And even if you do have plastic tubs and you're just not able to transfer them out, wrapping them in acid-free paper or having some sort of barrier is going to go a long way to you eventually being able to move them into a more stable environment. So that's sort of a little bit of an overview of each one of these artifacts and documents and object types of at-home preservation. But again, just as a summary, if you can get these items into a stable environment for temperature and light and humidity, you're going to go a long way in preserving them already. So now let's go into the last two portions of the discussion. First of all, preserving the future of your history. So now that you have all of your, artifacts and documents secure, they're in an internal closet in your house and it feels good. How do you think about the future of them as well? One of the most important things that I think that you can do is create a digital backup. So this is scanning artifacts, photographing artifacts, and creating this digital version of your family collection. So when you're creating these digital files, I know that I am try to be as safe as possible with backups. So we recommend at least two different places for backups. So one of them could be an external drive, one of them could be cloud-based. But this will give you a lot of peace of mind when it comes to different things that you might encounter, losing the artifacts, natural disasters. So when you're creating the digital backup, you might ask, how do you go about it? Scanners are probably one of the fastest and easiest ways. So if you have a ton of photographs and documents that you want to digitize, having a simple scanner printer combo actually goes a long way. So, and they don't have to be expensive at all. Many of these flatbed scanners can have very high resolution scans, upwards of 3,500 DPI, which is higher than any of us really need. So if you just have an at-home scanner bed, then you'll be able to start scanning those photographs. And again, just moving them very carefully and delicately. Now, one of the things that you'll encounter is not everything fits on those scanner beds. They're usually 8.5 by 11 or just slightly larger. But many people have legal documents in their possession. So there are different types of scanners that you can also invest in. There are overhead scanners that are sort of the free form that you can use. There are handheld wands as scanners that you can use. And then also, if you only have a few documents, UPS, mail print stores, they actually have large beds that you can scan on, especially if you only have a few documents. Now, when you're doing this, I highly recommend that you don't just photocopy what you're scanning, but you also create a JPEG or a TIFF of at least 600 DPI, which is what most of these scanners will be able to do. So if you have it and DPI is a measure of resolution. So basically when you're going in and there are the different options, there's going to be a little resolution button. You click that, and where it says DPI, just choose the highest setting that you can do. And we can also, if you have specific questions, go into that a little bit more deeply. So as you're creating those digital scans, being able to save them to 2 locations is very important. So moving on, and one thing I will say, if you are going to the mail print store, bring a USB jump drive with you. That will enable you to be able to scan right to it. Okay, so now that you've scanned everything, you have all of these items, where do you store it? Again, as you've heard me not so subtly hinting throughout this entire presentation, please try to move them from your basement and your attic and into the interior of your house. Ideally, moving them into a closet or a room that doesn't hit an exterior wall, because if it's an exterior wall, it tends to be a little bit hotter or colder depending on the season. So if you have a small closet, especially if you're able to keep these artifacts off of the floor, this will protect them from light. It will keep them very safe in terms of climate control and temperature. And perhaps most importantly, it keeps them within your eye. A lot of times if these documents get relegated to the attic or maybe a room that you don't go into very often, then we tend to forget about them, and they always end up being a task we never quite get. So if you can move those items into a space that's sort of a little bit closer to where you are, it also helps you monitor the temperature as well. Because like I said, if you're uncomfortable, your artifacts are probably going to be a little bit uncomfortable as well. One final note about storage locations, we don't actually recommend off-site storage for your documents and artifacts. One key reason is because if you put them there, you might not go and check in on them very often. However, if you're moving or you need a short-term location, one thing to ask for is to make sure it's not just temperature controlled, but also humidity controlled. So that's sort of like a climate control combo that some storage units do have. And the other thing that you can request is have it off of the first floor. So that just gives you a little bit of peace of mind, especially if you're in a flooding prone area. that's not something that you'll have to encounter. But again, if you can go ahead and keep that collection close to you, that's ideal for the longevity of it. One brief note about natural disasters, having your items out of the attic and basement, that helps you sort through things a lot more easily. I recommend a go box for your artifacts. So just having some of your most precious photo albums, documents, little treasures in a box, this definitely cuts down on some of the stress if there's an evacuation order, to be able to just get it and go. However, most importantly, your life is the most important thing in this. So please do not go back for a box of items, especially if you have a digital backup. But as always, your life is the most important when it comes to natural disasters. Okay, and this leads us to the conclusion, which is creating your family story. This is one of the best ways of preserving your family's history. A lot of times we have all of these random documents around and photographs, and it's hard to wrap our minds around it. But once we create a family story, once we actually create a narrative, it's something that's easier to pass down and share with others as well. So one of the first things to do is to plan. What is the history or what is the future of these items? Talk to your family members. See if there's someone who's interested in carrying them on as well. But this isn't always the case. You can also talk to a local museum and historical society. Your family's documents are fascinating, and sometimes they won't fit with a certain museum's collection, but connecting with a historical society or a museum can help you know if there are organizations that are interested in connecting your family history with their collecting area. The next thing to do with planning is to figure out what you want this family history to look like. Is it a written book? Is it a digital scrapbook? Are you trying to answer a very specific research question? So once you plan out what you're wanting to do with these artifacts, it makes the next steps much more easy to follow. So now going into collecting, this is the fun part. This is where you're gathering all of your artifacts and your documents. You're collecting oral histories with your family and friends. It's where you're grabbing your genealogy records. So as you're collecting, try to keep little research notes. So if there's a photograph, write down who you can identify in it, when you think it might have been. And so try to keep these again in a sort of a central location. So moving from collecting to organizing, collecting is the really fun part. Organizing can be the overwhelming part because oftentimes we have these huge boxes with tons of items. Nothing makes any sense in them. So what I recommend is if you don't know where to start, just create an inventory without the pressure of reorganizing. So for each one of the boxes, as you're pulling off those rusty paper clips, just jot down what's in that box. It can be as simple as, you know, my great-grandfather's 1890s immigration papers and my son's 1970s yearbook. But just create a document, a little inventory list, put it in the box, keep one in your research file, and then once you've gone through all of your boxes, you'll have a bird's eye view of everything that you have. And then you can go into different ways of organizing the information, which again, is a huge other topic altogether. The next step is to create. This is oftentimes a lot of fun. You can try starting with a timeline if you don't know where to begin. So look at different milestones along the way for your family. And you can create these milestones using the documents and the artifacts and the photographs that you have. And then moving from that timeline, even if you're creating a digital scrapbook or something short, I highly recommend creating a narrative summary. It's just 1, 2, 3 pages overview about your family. This helps wrap your head around what your family story is. And it's a really great jumping off place, even if you're going into a longer history. And I have to say, I pretty much cry tears of joy when I see a family summary document in a collection that we are accessioning or that we're taking into our museum. So it's also something that's easier to share through the generations as well. And then finally share it. Once you have created, you know, this family history where you've looked at it from different angles and perspectives and put it into context, share it with your family and share it with your friends and share it with us. We would love to hear about it. And this is a process that should be fun and exciting. And you're really becoming an archaeologist of your past and of your history. So it's something where we're all historians in our own right when we're creating this. And so when you create it, we hope that we'll be able to take part in it and engage with it as well. So that's a sort of a very, very quick overview of the preservation techniques and everything else in terms of crafting a family history. I think we're going to go to some questions now. Okay.
Yes. So thank you. That was and
Oh, I think you're on mute.
What?
Are you on mute?
Oh, am I on mute? Oh, I am.
Oh, I was on mute. I just said something brilliant. I was on mute. Oh, well.
Oh, okay.
I was thanking Anna Tucker for a brilliant program, so thank you very much. I think there are some questions, a couple of questions out there. I see that that's not Charles Hart. That's Charles Hart's better half.
It's Jan.
But she's going to have to unmute herself. No, go ahead.
I think I did. And
Can't hear you.
can
Nah, can't hear you.
you? Well,
Sorry.
unmute.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Can you repeat the question?
No, she's muted.
In identifying, can you hear me? Nope.
We did.
Not hearing her. I'm so sorry. We're just not hearing you. Something to
I
do with the
hear
crazy
her.
technology.
I hear her.
Oh, you
We
can
hear
hear
her.
her. Some people
Yes.
can hear her, and
I'm
some
wanting
people can't hear her.
I'm wanting to know
Interesting.
how to identify the photographs, where to write the names. Now I can't hear.
Diana's on it.
No, I got it. Well, this will be super smooth soon, maybe like 2 hours. No, that is a fabulous question. So, and I just to make sure I got it right, it's where do you identify the photographs? So one of the recommendations, probably the top recommendation, is having a piece of paper along with it, or if it's matted, writing it on the mat or the accompanying piece of paper. So the ideal is to not write on the photograph. But again, that's not always reality, and I'm trying to be as practical as possible. So what we recommend is, if that's not possible, flipping the photograph over and using a soft graphite pencil. So don't use pens or markers, even if they're soft markers. Using a soft pencil to lightly write on the back of it. I think there's a 2B pencil that works very well for this. So again, just lightly writing, not sort of pushing down so it doesn't, push through the photograph. But if you do need to write on it, that's what we recommend. And I have to say, when things come through the collection and I flip it over and there's something written on the back, I do sometimes breathe a sigh of relief. But best practices is to have an accompanying piece of paper along with it.
Okay, thank
So,
you.
Joe, I think you emailed us a question, didn't you? Ugh. Now, Joe's, hold on. I'm not able to unmute him.
I'm just wondering what you recommend for just the layman in terms of a scanner. What is the best kind of scanner to capture an image, an historic image, and which does it relatively quickly, which is easy to use. One that you can use for either a photo, or in some cases, if you've got something in a sticky album and the floss won't take the image off, is there some kind of a scanner that you can perhaps put the scrapbook itself on? What do you recommend?
Yeah, I try not to do a product endorsement, but I tend to use Epson flatbed scanners. So those can, range anywhere from the 100 to multiple hundred range. You don't need anything more than sort of the standard model. So they also, with the Epson scanners, they sometimes have larger sizes as well. which is very, it's great if you have different types of documents. And Epson is a pretty solid brand to use for that. And in terms of if it's still sort of in the lamination, or if it's in the sort of in the photo album page, sometimes if you're getting glare, you can put a piece of paper behind it to sort of try to minimize some of the bounce back light from the scanner. But a lot of times they actually turn out pretty well, even if they're behind that film. But all in all, I would say a flatbed scanner. Now, if you have plenty of books that you're wanting to scan that have that crease in the middle, you don't really want to like push down on the book. So having an overhead scanner would be better if you're using artifacts that you don't want to sort of push down on. This is also important if you have, a document that's severely creased, or it's being difficult to handle. If you have an overhead scanner, then you don't even have to really touch it apart from gently positioning it. But having a flatbed scanner, especially Epson or any of the major brands, really works great.
But just the key is that it's 600 DPI is really what you want in terms of.
Yep. So 600 DPI. A lot of these scanners will go higher, but you don't necessarily need more than 600.
Thank you.
I have a question, which is that, because you just mentioned if something is folded. So if you have, let's say you have letters that are already folded, or you have a big confirmation certificate that's been folded and squished flat, is it better to keep it like it is, or is it better to try to unroll it and flatten it out?
Our best practices is to flatten the object as long as it doesn't stress or break the artifact, which I know is a very fine subjective line. So if it is a letter, we do recommend very gently unfolding, and it's sort of testing to see whether it's breaking or if it's crumbling. And so just doing it very gently. But if you have a confirmation certificate, trying to unfold it, because the longer it's creased, the deeper those creases are going to be. So there are archival folders that are oversized, that are 11 by 17 and even above. So for even these oversized ones, if possible, create them, lay them flat, but again, don't force an artifact. So if it's starting to crack or crinkle, or you're just getting bad vibes from it, you can keep it folded.
Are there any other questions out there? Jay.
Yeah,
Some guy named Jay Tannenbaum has a question. Let's let
actually,
him.
I was just going to add a comment to what Anna was talking about a minute ago. Sometimes you're trying to archive or to create a digital image of a book or something that's in a binder. And Anna, you may know a little more about this than I do, but now there actually are scanners that have software that will automatically adjust. Anna mentioned, don't try to press down too hard in the middle. You don't know if you're going to destroy the book or the binding. There's now digital software that some scanners have loaded already that will take that distortion, that will take that curve right out of the book binding without you having to press down. So for people who are interested in digitizing certain things, that might be something you want to look for.
Yeah, Jay is absolutely right. And they've really come far with this technology recently, where if you're even scanning an entire book, they can actually scan the pages very quickly for you as well. So those are the ideal if you have a lot of artifacts that are not lying flat.
Another option is to pay some starving graduate student to come and scan all your stuff for you. They're always looking for a handout. I remember when I was, so that's another option. And by the way, everyone, Jay Tannenbaum is the chair of our museum board, and the inspiration and the spirit and the force of nature behind making this museum a reality. So good to see you, Jay.
Thank you, Kenneth. I'm just thrilled to see so many people joining to listen to this program, and that we've come to the point that we don't even have a museum open yet, but you and Anna and the rest of the team is already
Okay,
putting
it
on
looks like
some
we have a couple of questions in the chat. Okay, I see one from S Sherman who's asking about transferring movie films to DVDs backed up to an external hard drive. So they mentioned both of these technologies are going away. How do you suggest preserving movies for generations to come? The same for photos that are digitized on CDs. So great question. And I really like the way that this is part of the this is evidence that preservation is an ongoing process. So even when we start converting things to new file formats, we have to always be thinking ahead and saying, okay, DVDs are going away. And I remember when DVDs first came out and it was the hugest thing. So just thinking about the next step right now, I recommend digital file formats for photos, actually having them as a JPEG or a TIFF on an external drive or in the cloud instead of a DVD or a CD, because those can get scratched. They're warped from heat as well. And then also converting film to MP4 or another file format that can live on an external drive or in the cloud as well. So that's a great question. The other thing that you can also do is there are services that will help you with this. So let's see, I think I see something besides copying 8mm to VHS. What do you recommend for film preservation? Yes, so for film preservation, this is an area where I do recommend getting professionals involved with it. So there are services out there that will take your film, your VHS, even your photographs, slides, negatives, and will convert them to a different file format and sort of having a conversation with them and say, you know, I want this to, I'm looking at both use now. I want to easily be able to access it. I don't want it to be in a format that just lives somewhere that I can't get to. But also I want it to last for a while. Having that conversation with someone who's a specialist in this area is the way to go. But yeah, great questions about how to think forward on media. Let's see if we can go through. That is, and I'm guessing if it's something that's actually sticking to it, if this is an item that's very precious to you, and it sounds like it is, I would recommend going to a conservator. A lot of times when it's sticking, there's been some heat damage to it. Conservators have a whole arsenal of very safe chemicals or different mechanical approaches that are going to be safer for it. So if at all possible, go to a conservator and see about a consultation. They can also give you some practical advice specific to your item that will preserve it. But if it's sticking to the glass, talk to a conservator about that.
Lisa Newcomb has a question.
Hi, did I take you off of mute? Yeah. I have a question. You talked about having boxes of pictures, and you know, I have a box that probably has over 500 pictures, and that's one of, you know, 4 or 5 boxes that I have. And one of the things that would be helpful is talking about how to get them into something more manageable. I know you talked about the cloud, but I recently inquired with Apple, and what I found out is that your devices only hold the last 1,000 pictures actually on the device. The rest of it goes to the cloud, and not all of it necessarily stays in the cloud forever. So that is not something that's safe. And you know, you talked about digitizing them, but you know, then you're doing one piece at a time, and you're gonna end up with twice as much as what you had before. And I guess I would appreciate if you could talk about, you know, how do you take these boxes of a zillion pictures and bring them into something that's manageable. Nobody else besides those of us who are interested in the pictures is going to want to look through a box. The box will get thrown out, and the double box with the digital and the paper that you have is going to get thrown out. So it would be helpful perhaps to have another workshop on the nuts and bolts of putting together albums. And
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that would be a great workshop, and something that deserves an entire workshop, because there is a whole almost science to how do you select, what to save, how do you convert it into another format, how do you name it. And I think sort of the snapshot of a way to get started is, you're sort of the curator of your family's history. So, and the items that you have. So as you sit down and go through, and I know those 500 photos and how exhausting and overwhelming it can be. One way that you can do is sit down and look for milestones and highlights. So if you look through, say you have that 500 stack, some of those photos will be 20 photos from the same event. So you could go through and select one or two of those photos that maybe shows, a large number of people or something that specifically happened in that event, or was just simply meaningful to you. And those are the three that you sort of pull out and set aside as a milestone or a highlight. And then you sort of go through, your collection. And it does take a little bit of time to sort of work through and decide what to choose or not to choose, and sort of doing it in segments so it's not overwhelming, I think is very helpful. But a lot of times thinking of it like a milestone. So say you were a photojournalist, and of the 500 photos, you could only choose 10 or 15 that told this story. What would those be? And then you start with that. And I'm not saying, immediately take those rest of the photos and toss them out, but you can set them aside for the next session. Or as you're crafting your family story, maybe something comes up and you think, maybe there was something in that photo that I missed. And you can go back to that full archive. But I agree, it is impossible to try to digitize the thousands of photographs that we all probably have. So thinking of it like milestones or a highlight reel might be one way to make it a little bit more manageable.
So let's take one more question that's been submitted through the chat, and that is, what about documents that are written in other languages? And this is Susan's question, and she asked specifically Hebrew, Yiddish, etc. So Anna, do you have any ideas?
Okay. I don't see the question, so just let me know if I'm not fully answering it. I love it when there are documents in other languages. They're so exciting because a lot of times they show sort of a transnational existence. So there are a lot of exciting things with them. But if you don't speak that language, it's like a lost box. So there are a few different ways that you can go about it. One is there are researchers and translators who will translate it for you. You can also go to a museum and ask if there's anyone on staff, maybe for a small fee, who would be able to translate it, or if it's part of a collection that might be good for the museum, they might be able to just accession it and translate it for you. The other thing that is helpful, and this comes from over a decade of working at a university, is there are plenty of language courses that might be interested in having a workshop or using a sample letter as a translation tool. Now, Yiddish is, there aren't tons of classes on Yiddish or types of Hebrew, but if there's German, especially if there's an archaic form of German, reach out to your local university or college and just see if there is a program or a professor who might be willing to have her or his class translate that letter. So there are avenues. Some of them might cost something. Others might just take a lot of labor, but please keep those documents, at least until you find out a little bit more info about it.
And I can offer I can offer one specific, which is if you're on Facebook, the Jewish genealogy portal, people are always putting up photographs or scans of a letter or a headstone in a cemetery and saying, can somebody help me translate this? And it's generally Hebrew or Yiddish. And within an hour, 17 people from around the world will offer their translations. It's really nice. And But specifically for our museum, I want to give a shout out to Robert Wolf here in New Orleans, because he's done some wonderful translation of some German documents for us. And we really appreciate that. So if there are folks out there that speak German, that speak Yiddish, that speak French, let us know if you're interested in volunteering, because when we get those items, we will send them out to you to help us translate them. And we would love that kind of help. So I'm going to let Anna say her final thoughts, and then I'll say my final thoughts, and then we can all go get ready for the hurricanes.
So just sort of in conclusion, thank you so much for your time tonight. And I'm excited to see so many people interested in preserving your family's history, because so many times I have people come and they're like, oh, my family, they didn't do this. It wasn't important. I have yet to meet a family's history that wasn't fascinating in some aspect. So the time and commitment that you're putting into this goes a long way. Again, it can seem overwhelming. So this was just a snapshot to just sort of start the conversation about how to move this along. And we hope that you see us as a resource. We're a collecting museum. We're knee deep in the curation of the opening exhibits right now, but we would love to talk with you and work with you and help connect you with resources to make sure that your family history is preserved.
Anna, thank you so much once again. That was a wonderful program. I hope y'all out there in Zoom land and Facebook Live land enjoyed it. We will be putting up a recording of this fairly soon on our YouTube channel, and we'll let you know. And again, I will just end by asking you for your support for this museum. If you enjoy programs like this, if you think they're important, if you think our mission to explore the importance of life in the Jewish South, then please support the museum, because the work of a museum is the work of many hands, many hearts, and as we say, many wallets. So thank you again, and we'll see you next time. Bye.